We face, in the Western world, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, a new extremist movement. And we can call it the alt-right, we can call it nationalist populism, we can call it neo-fascism, we can call it whatever we want. The grievance it feeds on is the cultural and economic shock of mass migration from the poor world to the Western world. I think the consensus of many people on the liberal side is the way to deal with this extremist movement is with a policy of confrontation only. They are wrong, they must be scolded, and they must be told that they are completely mistaken and no concessions at all. And so in describing the ways in which the Trump administration is dangerous, its attitude toward immigration has been taken not as a source of its strength, but as its most odious marker and the thing to be most militantly confronted. And I would like to suggest that you think about this in a different way, and that we find in dealing with the grievances that animate the rising tide of extremism across the Western world some of the wisdom of the generation of 1945 to 1960, and understand there are some concessions that have to be made here if you want to move away the sources of power and dynamism and strength from the extremist movements that threaten your democratic institutions. I notice when this is a hard thought to process. Daniel Zilblatt, whose book I so lavishly reviewed and whose wisdom I really cherish and admire, in his list of norm violations in the run-up to Donald Trump, I mean, I'm a Republican, so I noticed it was a kind of Democratic-heavy list. All the norm violations were committed by Republicans. And I will admit the situation is asymmetric, that what the Republicans have done in the period from 2000 to 2016 was more and worse than what the Democrats did, and in particular the threat to put the United States into default unless they won their every single demand they had in the budget negotiation. That was an unprecedented thing and really dangerous, a mark of how this country is tumbling down the stairs toward ever more extreme behaviors, ever more willingness to contemplate out of the ordinary measures in order to get your way. But here's runner-up to that, the second most important norm violation of the period, or the second most important executive branch, second most important norm violation, the most important executive branch norm violation, was President Obama's immigration orders. You'll remember that in Obama's first term, he was repeatedly pressed, can you do some kind of executive action on the illegal alien population? I took a tally, I've written a book about this. I have found, and I'm not a great researcher, 6 specific instances where President Obama described this action as illegal, as a violation of presidential authority, as something that was absolutely not to be thought of. I'm not a king, he would say. I do not have this power. But as the 2012 election got closer and closer, and as he became more nervous, because you'll remember 2012, the economy looked really strong in the early part of 2011, and then it began to slow down in the second half of 2011. In the early parts of 2012, it looked like the economy might be stalling, and so it might be an incumbent unfriendly moment. President Obama issued the first, and 2 years later, before the 2014 elections, he issued the second of an executive order that legalized, in one case, about 800,000 people, and in the second case, a group of about 5 million people, in a way that he himself had described as lawless. And the courts agreed, by the way. The 2012 measure is still on the books, but the 2014 measure was thrown out by district courts, circuit courts, and then by a 4-4 decision of the United States Supreme Court. Why is that so important? That issue, that sense that the barriers of the country were down, was a powerfully animating force in the Donald Trump campaign. That's obvious. After it was all over, after the campaign ended and Donald Trump was elevated to the presidency, the immigration debate was reported on according to a certain convention. This is the way we write about it. If you could identify that the person complaining about mass migration had somehow been an economic loser, their wages had been impinged on, or they'd been crowded out of an emergency room, then the complaint was fair. If it was about money, you could complain. If it was a sense of cultural displacement, or loss of power, or status, or prestige, absolutely out of bounds. And if it was a sense of, I'm a citizen, and it means something, then you're dealing with a racist or a crank or worse. One of the things that, as we contemplate the strength of democracy and this vulnerability of democracy, we have to take more seriously, in my opinion, than we have done, the connection that was argued in the 19th century between the nation state and democratic modes of government. We have not found a way and I don't think we ever will, to do democratic government in any way other than through nation states. Nation states made of citizens, nation states with borders. The nation state did not have a very good run in the period from 1914 to 1945, and not even, and better, but still in many ways to be left something to be desired run from 1945 to 1989. And so many people of goodwill saw the answer to the problems of our time was to weaken the nation state in favor of broader attachments to humanity. What we discovered instead, as we've dissolved it, what we are discovering is that people do not move from citizenship bonds to broader bonds, but to narrower bonds, to ethnicity and to race. And that is what is happening in Europe, and that is what is happening here. Our topic today is what is to be done, and there's a lot to be said. But I think a new politics of the center meets the slogan, America first, with all its ugly associations, with a doctrine of Americans first. And that means doing some things that draw from the traditional political left, that is strengthening the material connections between citizens and state, in particular by re-thickening the social welfare state in the American context, especially in the area of health. But it also means strengthening the idea of citizenship by putting citizenship first and drawing more sharply the line between those who belong to the polity and those who don't, those who have entered the polity in legitimate ways and those who have sought entry in illegitimate ways, and forcing that barrier to make it clear to all that the people who have done well in a world in which fewer and fewer do well still remember the people who have not done so well. Thank you.